Hi, this is Jamie Kinsley and part 2 of how we bury our loved ones and the unloved. In this episode, I'm going to look at the city cemetery. So my methodology, I will examine who has the right to a written death, further looking at ethnicity, class, and gender within York County. I'll look at the meaning on some of these stone epitaphs or the lack thereof, looking for clues and the people and community who lived here hundreds of years ago. So in this episode, I'll specifically go into the city cemetery. This is straight to the right of Prospect Hill Cemetery. It is an unidentified grass lot. Right here in this building is where I used to live in an apartment on the second floor. And so I thought it was interesting when I would look out of my apartment and I found this grass field. I didn't know what was there. There usually weren't kids playing there, and there weren't people there like walking their dogs or anything. It's largely fenced off except for a small opening. And I found out a few months later that there are upwards of 800 people buried there in unidentified graves. So this made me think about class and how, just like in life, we overtly signal our class through the cars that we drive, the square feet of our homes, and then also the brand clothes that we wear. And so I thought about the mausoleum that was right next door in Prospect Hill, which is gorgeous and beautiful. It also radiates our class, and same goes for in life and in death. So going back to the Potter's Field and the history of it. So the Potter's Field wasn't always there. It was moved there in the late 1800s. Originally, it was right here. So a present day St. Patrick's Church. There used to be just a field right here, which this is West College Avenue between South Beaver Street and South Cherry Lane. People who could not afford to have their own burial plot, or they had no family members, or they were unidentified, were sent to this Potter's Field. The system worked like this. The city physician would coordinate the paperwork. The engineer then would locate and identify the specific burial site in the grass field, and then a public works crew came in and dug a grave for them. In 1897, that's when we wanted the land in the city center, so they decided to inter the bodies there, and they brought them to the Potter's Field that I showed you, which is to the right of Prospect Hill. I am now going to go specifically into one of the primary documents I found, which is one of the only living documents of the Potter's Fields, which shows you the plans and the lines and the lots where you can see where people are specifically buried. It is difficult to read. You can pause the video and zoom up on it. I can also get you access to this, and it is public record, so you can ask to see it through City Hall. But do you see how all the places that are grayed out, that is where bodies correspond with the names over here on the right? And then the ones that are white, we can assume don't have any people buried there. They're open plots. Now over here, though, if we look a little bit more closely, this is labeled as double row of graves. The people who were dug up from the original Potter's Field located down where St. Patrick's is current day, this is where they went. And so there are over 600 bodies that are buried right here with no names and no way to identify them. This is not unique to York County. All across the country, we have individuals from society who are deemed worthless or illegitimate. So they are abandoned. And so society wants to cover up these bodies while simultaneously covering up our ills. So people who would have been born in these city cemeteries would be non-Christians, unwed mothers, criminals, babies, people who were not baptized, or people considered morally loose. So we can't say for sure if this is the type of people that were identified in the city cemetery in York. This was more of a national trend, but we can figure out what's happening in our area by studying others and what happened across the country. We do know that a lot of people that were buried there died from smallpox. So I looked at York's health record from 1890, and again, this is all public access. You can check this out for yourself. It actually lists all the causes of death and the number of people who died from it. Smallpox was by far the most common. So I want to go now into race and class and the intersection of the two. So when I zoomed up and looked at the individuals that are buried in Potter's Field, you can see their names are there. And then to the right of them, we either have B for black, W for white, or C for colored. So over time, how we categorize people based in this social construct we call race changes. So B when black and then C for colored, talking about the same type of people, or would have been considered mulattoes, which would have been biracial people. At this time period in New York in the early 1900s, there was segregation. So blacks and whites were separated. But if you look here, there were blacks and whites that are buried right next to each other. And on plot 354, there are two different babies. One was white and one was black, and they're buried in the same grave. So on one hand, this is very interesting because we weren't segregated, but it is interesting then how race may have been a dividing factor, but class then united people. So people who were poor, didn't matter what color you were just thrown into one lot in York County. One of the reasons why Potter's Fields became more popular is because of the commodification of the funeral industry. In the late 1800s, these practices are going to grow more elaborate with interior casket trimmings, expensive outfits, both for people within the casket, but then also people who are attending the funerals, and then the embalming process. Because of this commodification, it gets expensive, and so people are going to turn to the Potter's Fields more often. We also have the ugly laws. So this is legislation that legally segregated people considered unsightly. So if you had a war injury or a birth defect or an industrial accident, it was actually legal for the state to say that you could not go out in public. State lawmakers use the legal system to erase people. Specifically in Chicago, they forbade any person who is diseased, maimed, mutilated, or deformed in any way so as to be unsightly or disgusting object to expose himself in public view. Couldn't even go out in public. I'm very happy to report that we no longer have these laws on the books. People who are disabled, we're trying to have more access within mainstream culture, but this is a part of our heritage, and it is important to recognize our dark past, but then also how far we've come. Feelings towards poverty has also changed immensely. So during this time period, there were three explanations for why someone was in poverty. The first is an individual explanation, so personal choices or character traits that were somehow flawed that caused them to make poor decisions. We also had structural explanations, such as societal norms, laws, and systems, so more of a systemic explanation, and then fatalistic explanations, which were uncontrollable bad luck or accidents, something like Calvinism, where if you believed that God had an idea or planned everything out for you, that would be your explanation. During this time period, it was exclusively individual explanations. Today, a lot more people believe in society as causing poverty, but in the late 1800s, it was purely the person's individual choice. It was their fault. There's something that they did that was their blame for why they lived the way they lived. We still see this a little bit today where lower income people are still marginalized, and there needs to be more acceptance, including here in New York. We do, though, have a lot of programs, initiatives, and philanthropic endeavors working towards changing this idea of poverty, which I'm very proud of. So some takeaways from today's presentation. One is people who study gravestones are facing their morality, and even people who, if you take a walk from the cemetery and just take a second to stop and read the tombstones there, it is a cursory look into the lives of the people whose bodies lay just below our feet. And then walking through a cemetery also helps us recall stories. These memories give us a foundation to better understand ourselves and our communities. A lot of the stones then left messages. You'll read them and you'll learn more about the local craftsman and the family who selected the imagery, the iconography on the tombstones, these personal messages that you'll see that were meant for people to visit them later. You also, though, see a lot of unintended messages through City Cemetery, for example, where we permanently marginalized the poor, finalizing their place in society on the outskirts, unidentified and forgotten. So we study York's past in Potter's Field to understand our historic view of class privilege, even in death. If you do go there, you will see one stone. That's how you know you're in the right spot. Says a City Cemetery there. So I have to leave you with this question. When we look at Potter's Field, think about who's going to take care of you after you die. If you want to learn more, please go to wonderinginnewyork.com or Witnessing York. I'm Jamie Kinsley. Thank you for joining me.